In 3 weeks, ordinary Russians lost two-thirds of their savings. A handful of men used those same 3 weeks to become billionaires. The official explanation was a liquidity crisis, a bond market under pressure, an emerging market contagion spreading west from Bangkok and Jakarta. And, to be fair, all of that is technically true. But it leaves out the part where the rules of the auction were written by the people who were about to win it. A design feature built years earlier by a red-haired economist named Anatoly Chubais, and exploited most visibly by a then-obscure businessman named Roman Abramovich. We're going to find out how $100 million became $13 billion, and why the mechanism that made it possible wasn't a bug in Russia's transition to capitalism. It was the architecture. Russia's bold experiment with free markets is finally bearing fruit. The IMF has dispersed $4.8 billion to stabilize the ruble exchange rate. GKO yields are now approaching 150%. Bond markets are signaling something. Russian depositors are lining up outside banks. Accounts are frozen. The Kremlin calls concerns about privatization outcomes, quote, the politics of envy. Abramovich declines to comment. His spokesperson says he sees, quote, continued opportunity. Okay, so let's go back to 1991, because the 1998 collapse doesn't make sense without the decade that preceded it. The Soviet Union dissolved and left behind an economy with no functioning price signals, no private property law, no banking sector in any recognizable sense, and roughly $1 trillion in state-owned industrial assets that now needed, somehow, to belong to someone. The mechanism Anatoly Chubais designed as head of the State Property Committee was called voucher privatization. Between 1992 and 1994, his office distributed 144 million vouchers, each nominally worth 10,000 rubles, to every Russian citizen. The democratic promise was straightforward. Every Russian would own a piece of the new economy. What actually happened was something else. Most ordinary citizens, facing immediate poverty and no understanding of equity markets, sold or traded their vouchers at deep discounts for cash, or, famously, for bottles of vodka. Meanwhile, a small number of oligarch-linked investment funds accumulated controlling blocks across dozens of enterprises. 144 million vouchers were the democratic fiction. The economic reality was that the largest peacetime wealth transfer in human history ended up concentrated in perhaps 24 hands. But voucher privatization was only the first act. In 1995, Chubais designed something far more precise. This is the mechanism we need to examine carefully, and it has a name: loans for shares. The common understanding is that it was a privatization program, a way to restructure state ownership. In practice, it was a transfer mechanism disguised as a lending arrangement. Basically, a small group of politically connected banks offered to lend the Russian government money it desperately needed, accepting shares in major state enterprises as collateral. The government was structurally guaranteed never to repay those loans, which meant the shares would simply become the bank's property. That part alone would be remarkable enough. But here's the thing. The same banks that designed the lending terms also ran the collateral auctions. They set the reserve prices. They approved or rejected competing bids. The entire program transferred control of enterprises worth an estimated $100 billion in natural resources for loans totaling less than $2 billion. That ratio, $50 of assets for every $1 of consideration, is not a market outcome. It is a political one. The Sibneft acquisition is the clearest illustration of how the mechanism worked in practice. In December 1995, Abramovich and his partner Boris Berezovsky acquired Sibneft, one of Russia's largest oil companies, through a loans for shares auction. The winning bid was $100.3 million. The reserve price had been set by parties connected to the winning consortium. Outside bids were procedurally rejected on technical grounds. $100 million for a company sitting on billions of barrels of exportable crude. Please. Now, you might be thinking, surely foreign investors or Western banks saw this and pushed back. The IMF was actively engaged with Russia through this entire period, conducting Article IV consultations, issuing structural adjustment conditions, ultimately negotiating a $22.6 billion rescue package. In July 1998, just weeks before the default, the IMF disbursed a $4.8 billion emergency tranche specifically to defend the ruble's exchange rate band. The money was largely gone within weeks, with the IMF and World Bank later estimating that capital flight from Russia in 1998 alone totaled between $20 billion and $25 billion, routed through Cyprus-registered shell companies and correspondent banking relationships with Western institutions, including, most infamously, Bank of New York, where in 1999, the United States Department of Justice opened a formal investigation after discovering that approximately $7 billion in Russian funds had moved through accounts connected to oligarch networks between 1996 and 1999. So, what's happening here? Is this an emerging market liquidity crisis, or something more structural? And if it is structural, who exactly designed the structure? The answer requires understanding the GKO pyramid, which is Chapter 2 of this mechanism. GKOs, Государственные краткосрочные облигации, were short-term ruble-denominated government treasury bonds, essentially Russia's version of United States T-bills. The government issued them at escalating yields to roll over its debt, borrowing short to pay short in an accelerating cycle. By July 1998, annualized yields had reached 150%. That number is not a sign of an attractive investment opportunity. That is a bond market pricing in near certain default. Foreign investors held roughly 30% of the GKO market by 1998. When oil prices collapsed to approximately $11 per barrel in late 1998, pushed down by contagion from the 1997 Asian financial crisis, Russia's primary hard currency revenue source evaporated. The ruble collapse was ultimately an oil price collapse wearing a currency mask. On August 17, 1998, Prime Minister Sergei Kiriyenko signed the default announcement. The Russian government simultaneously defaulted on $40 billion in GKOs, the largest sovereign domestic debt default in history at the time. $40 billion was roughly equivalent to the entire GDP of Ukraine. In the 6 weeks that followed, the ruble collapsed from approximately 6 rubles per dollar to over 20 rubles per dollar. A middle-class Russian with the equivalent of $10,000 in ruble savings watched it become $2,500 in purchasing power. According to World Bank data, real incomes fell by nearly 40% over the crisis year. Russia's GDP contracted 5.3% in 1998 alone. So, to recap the mechanics so far, a voucher privatization that distributed democratic fiction, a loans for shares architecture that transferred industrial reality, a bond pyramid that absorbed whatever fiscal credibility remained, and then a currency collapse that extinguished ruble-denominated savings while leaving dollar-denominated assets intact. That last point is the one that matters most. Because Sibneft's revenues were priced in dollars through oil export contracts, Abramovich's core asset was dollar-denominated. When the ruble lost 75% of its value, his ruble-denominated costs fell dramatically, while his dollar revenues held. The devaluation functioned as a subsidy to exporters holding foreign currency revenue streams. Forbes estimated Abramovich's net worth at approximately $3 billion in 2000, 2 years after the collapse. By 2003, that figure had reached $13.4 billion, placing him among the 10 wealthiest people on Earth. The entire fortune was assembled between 1991 and 2003, a window that will never be replicable. The ruble's collapse also didn't stay inside Russia. Long-term capital management, the United States hedge fund run by Nobel laureates Myron Scholes and Robert Merton, lost $4.6 billion in under 4 months in 1998, with Russian GKO exposure among the triggers, forcing a Federal Reserve-orchestrated $3.6 billion private bailout in September of that year. The ruble collapse nearly detonated the global derivatives market from a Connecticut trading floor. That is how interconnected the GKO pyramid had become.
The fourth mechanism is the one that gets discussed least, and it is the most important. Loans for shares didn't just transfer assets. It transferred a particular kind of political option and proximity to Boris Yeltsin's inner circle, specifically his daughter, Tatiana Dyachenko, and her husband, Valentin Yumashev, functioned as a de facto property right in the absence of rule of law. In an economy where contracts were unenforceable and courts were captured, the real asset loans for shares participants were acquiring was not Sibneft. It was insurance against expropriation. That insurance had a visible expiration date. In October 2003, Mikhail Khodorkovsky, then Russia's richest man with an estimated net worth of $15 billion, was arrested. His oil company Yukos was dismantled and renationalized. The Yukos affair was the moment every surviving oligarch understood that legal title was irrelevant. Political loyalty was the only secure property right in Russia. Abramovich, who had maintained careful proximity to the Kremlin throughout, sold Sibneft to state-controlled Gazprom in 2005 for $13 billion. It was the largest corporate acquisition in Russian history. Gazprom's market capitalization briefly touched $300 billion, placing it behind only ExxonMobil and General Electric globally, a state energy company reconstructed on assets acquired for cents on the dollar. Loans for shares didn't privatize an economy, it privatized the state, and then the state bought it back. Now, the counterfactual question worth asking. What if the IMF had used its 1996 $10 billion lending leverage to condition disbursement on eliminating the loans for shares auctions? The Western leverage existed. It was not used. And honestly, the more difficult question is whether a transparent privatization would have produced a different outcome or simply a different list of names. The underlying problem was structural: no property law, no independent judiciary, no functioning capital markets. The mechanism could have been anything. The concentration of the result was probably overdetermined. What the 1998 template did produce, unambiguously, was a playbook. Putin used it in reverse, renationalizing assets from oligarchs who lacked political insurance, confirming retroactively that loans for shares never created property rights. It created temporary political licenses. In June 2003, Abramovich purchased Chelsea Football Club for £140 million and subsequently spent over £1 billion on player transfers. Hard Russian oil money converting into soft British cultural capital. Following Russia's February 2022 invasion of Ukraine, the UK Office of Financial Sanctions Implementation froze Abramovich's assets. Total frozen or blocked oligarch assets across the West reached approximately $50 billion by mid-2022. The same Western financial system that absorbed the capital flight became the enforcement mechanism. The Financial Action Task Force published its first non-cooperative countries list in 2000, partly in direct response to documented post-1998 capital flight and the failure of Western banks to apply basic know-your-customer standards. It took a ruble collapse, a hedge fund near catastrophe, and a Bank of New York scandal to produce what is now the baseline global anti-money laundering framework. The 1998 ruble crisis is remembered as a catastrophe. For most Russians, it was. But catastrophes distribute losses unevenly, and the loans for shares architecture guaranteed that the unevenness was not accidental. The rules of the auction were written by the people who were about to win it, years before the first bid was entered. Every economy has had its own version of loans for shares, a moment where the ownership rules were written by the future owners. The names change, the mechanism is older than Russia. Now we know what to call it.